Well, officially, hello everyone, bonjour tout le monde, and welcome to Concordia University's Fourth Space. Thank you so much for joining us for today's event, Questions from the Audience, Ethics Today. I will be passing it over to Stephen Powell to introduce today's special guest in a moment. But first, whether you're joining us online or in person, we wanted to let you know that we are streaming to YouTube Live from Fourth Space, which is located on unceded Indigenous lands here in Tiohtià:ke, Montreal. And we'd like to extend our gratitude to the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation who are the caretakers for the lands and waters we're meeting on today, for their teachings about the earth and our relations. At Fourth Space, we work with our university community to mobilize and exchange knowledge by co-creating daily activities. And so today, it's our great pleasure to have collaborated with the English department here at Concordia University to make this event possible. I'll just finally say, before Stephen, I pass it to you, that if you'd like to jump in with a question and for Hortense and you're in the space with us today, we've set up that mic stand there that Stephen's at, and we invite you to walk up there so that Hortense might be able to see you and hear you clearly, and you have a mobile screen to look at so that you might see her as well. And if you're joining us on Zoom, welcome in that space. I hope you're nice and comfy today in a warm, comfortable place. If you have questions or comments, you're more than welcome to turn on a camera, raise a hand, and we'll call upon you. Otherwise, the chat is activated if you'd like to pop something in there and we'll read it out for everyone. Okay, that's it for me. Over to you, Stephen. Welcome.
Good afternoon. I'm pleased to join Fourth Space in welcoming you to this year's Leahy Lecture. My name is Stephen Powell, and on behalf of the English Department and the Speakers Committee, I'm also thrilled to introduce Professor Hortense J. Spillers as this year's Leahy Lecturer. The Leahy Lecture has a long history. It began at Loyola College, one of Concordia's founding institutions, in the early 1960s, and has been given annually ever since. It honors Father Gerald F. Leahy, a Jesuit priest, a specialist on the poetry of Gerard Manley Hopkins, a longtime teacher of English at Loyola, and Loyola's rector from 1954 to 1959. The Leahy Lecture is often named as the longest continuous series of lectures hosted by the university. You won't be surprised that the pandemic has complicated the lecture series, but it has not stopped it. For the last 2 years, we've been compelled by COVID to move to a virtual format. This year, we're delighted that we'll again have a live audience for the event, even if our speaker cannot be here in person in the vibrant and innovative venue, Fourth Space, which is hosting us, and a big thank you to their amazing team for hosting us today. The list of former Leahy speakers is a roster of academic excellence and speaks to the department's aspiration to provide to Montreal's vibrant university community and to the greater communities of Montreal and Quebec provocative and cutting-edge discussions about literature, literary studies, and all forms of textuality. Professor Spillers is, by my count, our 59th Leahy Lecturer. Joining us from what I presume is her home in Nashville, but she may correct me on that, Professor Spillers is now Gertrude Conaway Vanderbilt Professor and Distinguished Research Professor Emerita at Vanderbilt University. A graduate of the University of Memphis only a few years after its integration, and a recipient of a doctorate from Brandeis, Spillers has held faculty appointments at Haverford, Wellesley, Emory, and Cornell, and joined the Vanderbilt faculty in 2006. She's held numerous visiting professorships and received countless awards and recognitions, among which, most recently, election to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the Wayne C. Booth Lifetime Achievement Award from the International Society for the Study of Narrative. She continues to be an active scholar and thinker with no signs of slowing down, as she writes on her university website, and I fear that my Ohio accent is going to butcher something that is written maybe a little bit further south from Ohio. I feel as though I'm just getting started good. Wherever her current projects take her, her career will forever be associated with her paradigm-shifting article, Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe, an American grammar book, published in 1987, anthologized frequently, and cited prolifically. In this article, Spiller jumps off in part from U.S. Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan's 1965 report on what he called the Negro family, and works to position Moynihan's conclusions in the light of the long, complex, and ugly history of the profound disruption of the Black family that began with slavery. Any summary of the article I give here will fail to do justice to its richness and complexity, its searing conclusions, and the profound reorientation in Black feminist studies it inspired. What I note about Spiller's work in this article and her many other publications, aside from evocative and sometimes playful language, is a seemingly effortless ability to tie together the vexed history of Black people in the United States with contemporary political developments through meticulous consideration of past and present writings. She consistently sheds dramatic and much needed light on both the tragedies of the past and the ongoing nightmare of the present, a nightmare we now understand in light, for example, of the political vilification of critical race theory, of police brutality, and of course murder, and of the seemingly endless deferral of the dream of racial equality in the United States, of course, but in Canada too, and so many other places. It's an honor to welcome Professor Hortense J. Spillers to Concordia University for this year's Leahy Lecture, Questions from the Audience, Ethics Today.
Oh, thank you very much, Professor Powell, for that generous introduction. It's wonderful to see you. And I can hear the audience. It would be lovely to see you. Perhaps one of these days I will be able to come back to Concordia and get a chance to see the people who are doing the applauding. So let me start by thanking Professor Powell also for the invitation that creates this occasion that brings me to Concordia. I was in your city over the holidays, over New Year's. I was just telling one of my hosts, I don't think that was the best time to be in Montreal. I hope to come back in better weather. So what I'd like to talk with you about today is something that is always on my mind. I suppose you could say it does belong to a larger project, even though it would probably take too long to describe what that larger project is, and it's something that I share with all of us, and that is the status of citizenship. And if we think of citizenship as a cultural apprenticeship, as a kind of project, that of course is ongoing, but it very directly relates to a life that runs alongside my life as a scholar. I think of myself in some ways as a kind of amateur journalist. As a matter of fact, I had ambition once upon a time of becoming a broadcast journalist. That was 100 years ago when I had that ambition, and was a disc jockey in undergraduate school. And that was supposed to be the gateway to my career as a broadcast journalist. Well, okay, I decided on scholarship instead of journalism, or the practice of law, or a career in politics. But I have never lost what must have been an initial love of civics and newspapers and that kind of thing. Today, I edit an online journal that I would invite you to pay attention to from time to time, called the A-Line Journal, a journal of progressive thought. And in editing that journal, I have to think about what we call, or what I used to call back in my days as a schoolgirl current events. I have to think about those events in some kind of systematic way, so that questions from the audience really grows out of a concern about current events, and current events of our time are unlike anything we've ever seen before. And it is that the unprecedented nature of what I feel is a crisis. It's a crisis in our political order in North America, particularly in the United States. It's a planetary crisis, a crisis of the environment. Everywhere we look, the term crisis is appropriate. So my thinking today, question from the audience, I mean, in other words, what does an opinion that is not expert, because it is confronting so much of what we do not have answers to and answers for, what would those questions be, so that I'm thinking of myself in this lecture in a kind of inverted position. I mean, in other words, I am a member of the audience and not so much somebody who's giving expert answers or giving expert opinions in a lecture. I'm a part of an audience asking questions like members of the audience, and that's why I give it the title that I'm giving it. So that a part of the problem is how to formulate what I wish to discuss, so that the problematic that I wish to confront, and I would acknowledge this right away, does not know how to announce itself, except as a crisis that permeates layers of public and private life, from civic and political order to the daily round of mundane activity that contains us in our little sacks of the personal. But perhaps one way that we might go about this is to do it colloquially, for starters, and perhaps starting it colloquially will help us sharpen our insight. And the way I put this colloquially is, how do we remain ethical in a world where a lot of the people we are dealing with is carrying at least a switchblade, if not an AR-15? And what exactly is the ethical, if there is, in fact, a state of things that some have called post-truth? Everywhere we look now, we are confronted with symptoms of what could be regarded as the definitive dismantling of codes of conduct that have prevailed at least all my life, the better part of a century, that both hollowed out human hope in the good offices of peace and goodwill and fomented it, on the other hand, in efforts at rehabilitation and redemption. On the one hand, the 20th century was the century of war and Holocaust, of lynching and domestic terrorism, as the entire spectacle of pulverization and murder, as Herman Melville might have put it, is complementary and interpenetrated between home and abroad. In other words, the theater of violence and domination that lends shape to Black life in the era of post-Reconstruction at the end of another century seems to map perfectly onto the scene of mass murder that characterizes world order from World War II to the official end of apartheid in South Africa. On the other hand, the 20th century, because it birthed a concept, certainly not the practice, called genocide, extends the League of Nations into the United Nations, and perhaps for the first time in the life of the world, a declaration of human rights that is not predicated on national imprimatur or under the impress of a particular flag or army. And this is what I'm referring to. On 10 December 1948, the General Assembly of the United Nations adopted Resolution 217A, quote, as a common standard of achievements for all peoples and all nations, a universal declaration of rights. Whereas recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. The General Assembly proclaims this declaration, and keeping it constantly in mind, shall strive by teaching and education to promote respect for these rights and freedoms, and by progressive measures, national and international, to secure their universal and effective recognition and observance, both among the peoples of member states themselves and among the peoples of territories under their jurisdiction. These 30 articles throw into bold relief the poignant exigency of global migration today and its propulsive impact on international politics from Hungary to Texas, USA. Within earshot of World War II, Brown v. Board opens a vista that will conclude in the 1960s and the official demise of U.S. apartheid in the Civil Rights Bill of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. It is probably not much of a stretch to read late century events, such as the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the USSR a couple of years later, as an elaboration of popular movement, young people, people and nations of color, communities of women, in the interest of human rights without borders. This general social movement then, over nearly a century, might be taken as the token of a complicated legacy that is simplistically understood as the worst of human conduct in its lust for blood and surrender, and the best of human conduct in its desire for justice and a sustainable peace. I think it is fair to say that the 20th century, despite its enormous potential for violence and destruction and its actual achievements of the latter, has not only exposed the raw underside of human depravity, but also a kind of dogged, naive determination to overcome it. And it is this shuttling back and forth between kinds of recognition, one laced with contempt and disgust, the other infused with hope and love, no less. And when I think of that, I think of some of the great teachers of that just past century, Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King, Nelson Mandela. I think of this dilemma, this moral and ethical astigmatism, we might call it, in terms that Toni Morrison lays out in Beloved, when Paul D., confronting Sever about the murder of one of her children, reminds her that she walks on 2 feet, not 4. Apparently, for the character Paul D., standing upright is supposed to mean something, as a great deal of signifying is packed into his simple utterance. One seeks a separate peace as one alternative to the most dangerous human failings, or a spiritual standing apart that might operate like an exilic consciousness. And I guess I could say, in terms of the jitters that we are feeling, and they are more than that, that some days are really better than others. So how do we do this standing apart? And is that what we really want? Well, the standing apart has its benefits, even if it is limited in its applicability. Those of us fortunate enough to be comfortably ensconced in circumstances of work that pays a living wage, in short, in life conditions that are not precarious. The term exile sounds peculiarly inappropriate, just as claiming its status appears to be especially odious and inappropriate. But when I speak of a separate peace as the elaboration of an exilic consciousness, I am pointing to the alienation that one feels from a society that seems to openly embrace lies. In fact, seems to prefer them over the truth at any given moment. The spectacle that engenders alienation appears to be without end, but we can readily identify some of the most provocative developments that silence speech. One of them, a 5th column movement, is what I would call it, after an earlier era of revolution and change, but a 5th column movement inside the United States that benefits from all the constitutional guarantees that it would jettison if it ever assumed power. This time is the first time I have ever known the United States presidency to have a shadow presidency, or an unofficial other government that is its own communications networks, or that has its own communications networks, like Fox News, for instance, whose owners have grown rich off the very system at which their malice and ill will take aim. For a second thing, a former president who foments division that threatens to annihilate the republic itself and to turn democracy into a criminal activity. And that's a very different thing from, or is not a very different thing from, Southern governors who stood in the schoolhouse door a couple of generations ago and barred it against Black children. King said in those days that their lips were dripping with nullification and interposition. But 6 January 2022 has no precedent in the history of the Republic. Or a third thing, the United States appears to be especially cruel to its children with its gun laws that do not touch assault weapons. We recall that the murdered children at Sandy Hook, Connecticut were mocked in their deaths by purveyors of filth who put out that these children had not died at all, but that the entire episode was a hoax, that it had been staged by actors. And as we know, the families of these young gun victims were awarded nearly $1 billion a couple of months ago in civil damages against its most egregious offender that I won't even give a name to. It's so offensive. So we could go on with this list of atrocities and depredations that must also include individuals of historical subjects who become themselves the bellwethers of dubitable conduct. And I refer to women subjects who participate in this damaging activity, or Black people or minorities and people of color who joined the ranks of, for instance, election deniers, of the revanchist reactionary movement that defines this particular juncture that threatens to overtake us. But suffice it to say, these are examples of the sort of breakdown that not only separates us from our neighbors and other citizens, but also other instances of rot and corruption that makes one wonder if she needs another society, another country. To be exiled, in fact, in that regard, the threat we feel is existential. Is that, after all, the real question? Not an ethical question, but an existential question? I'm reminded of another era at a similar moment and think of its evocations often. And this goes back some distance to the 19th century. J.W.C. Pennington, a famous Black minister and a Presbyterian preacher, had been enslaved in Maryland. You might know his narrative, the narrative of Pennington, Fugitive Blacksmith, or events in the history of James W.C. Pennington, pastor of a Presbyterian church in New York, formerly a slave in the state of Maryland. That's his story. On the 2nd of November in 1845, Pennington preached a farewell sermon to his Fifth Congregational Church in New York, titled A 2 Years Absence or a Farewell Sermon, on the question of slavery, which Pennington was addressing in this sermon. And that would have been a topic that was very much alive for J.C. Pennington and members of his audience. The pastor has this to say, quote, "If you stand commended to the guidance of the word of God, you are bound to know its position in reference to certain overt acts that crowd the land with curses. Take the last and greatest of the curses that I named above? Is the word of God silent on this subject? I, for one, desire to know. My repentance, my faith, my hope, my love, and my perseverance, all, I conceal it not, I repeat it, all turn upon this point. If I am deceived here, if the word of God, this man of God tells us, does sanction slavery, I want another book, another repentance, another faith, another hope. And as you might recall, that was also Frederick Douglass's attitude toward traditional or standard Christianity, as it called itself in the 19th century. And I'm afraid that particular version of the Christian church trails us right into the 20th century, out of it and into the 21st century. The evocation of a J.W.C. Pennington works for me now, many years and generations removed from his moment, because of the poignance of its passion and how that poignance translates over the century and a half since its rendering. But more than that, it seems to me an apt and exact response when one has run out of answers and options and faces a crisis. Such, in fact, is what a crisis is. It is a last moment at which a choice is enforced. We know the moment because it is rare. It stands out from its surround. It defines a state of exception. Perhaps then I am searching for an analogy on the exilic consciousness and turn to, for a moment, to Michel de Certeau's writing of history that might provide an out. In speaking about Sigmund Freud's Moses and monotheism, Michel de Certeau writes this: Moses and monotheism has much to do with suspicion, which is rupture, doubt, and with filiation, which is both debt and law. I take filiation here to refer to natal community in the general sense of belonging. Belonging engenders indebtedness, and in this case, law, from the point of view of Moses' role as the great law giver. De Certeau goes on. Membership is expressed only through distance, through traveling farther and farther away from a ground of identity. A name still obliges, but no longer provides the thing, this nurturing land. Thus, Freud must bet his place within writing. He gambles it with his cards on the table. He risks his relation with the real in the game organized by a loss. De Certeau appears to be working out here what the conditions of modernity and postmodernity entail when subjecthood has fallen into heterogeneity, anonymity, and I would say the political in general, where things are defined away from blood relations and kinship. The obligation to pay the debt, the refusal to abandon the name, and the people. As he puts it from scripture, Jerusalem, I shall not forget thee, and hence the impossibility of not writing or built over the dispossession of all genealogical languages. Is this on Descerteau's part an elegant brief for unrootedness or uprootedness, if not outright rootlessness? He continues, the work has no hereditary soil. It is nomadic. Writing cannot forget the misfortune from which its necessity springs, nor can it count on tacit, rich, and fostering evidences that provide for an agrarian speaker his intimacy with a mother tongue. Writing begins with an exodus. It proceeds in foreign languages. Its only recourse is the very elucidation of its travels in the tongue of the other. It is analysis. In this moving and exquisite interpretation of exile and estrangement, the human scene becomes a festival of strangers, which places an extra onus of responsibility on the ethical. Given that we are going forward on such a landscape without guarantees and assurances, in other words, one's sense of the world as an unwelcoming, inhospitable space and place from which one's estrangement is complete and complex, might not be an illusion. If I seek another country where truth is possible and ethical is its own reward, then that impassioned longing becomes my badge of honor, but also my cross. These very recent years, it has seemed as though it will never be right again. And I want to say that that's a way of segueing to Hannah Arendt, and a work that I came upon in preparing this talk and in trying to nail down my thoughts about how bad I'm feeling and why. I came upon this book, and of course, Hannah Arendt is sort of a man or a person for all seasons. But this particular text on lying and politics crossed my threshold at a particularly depressing or down moment, I would say, so that it was like the early arrival of Santa Claus. It was like a special gift. This is this small volume that contains two of Arendt's essays is a special publication from the Library of America. It's a slim volume that appeared just last year in 2022 with an introduction from David Bromwich. And it takes its clues and its cues from the Vietnam War and the Vietnam Papers. Those events provide the context for Arendt's reflections that are explored in a pair of linked essays. And though it provides fodder for thought in a very different era. It is an era contemporaneous enough or close enough to our own that I have found it enormously useful. Truth and Politics, one of the essays in the volume, was first published in the New Yorker, February 1967, and Lying in Politics, the second of the two, in the New York Review of Books, November 18, 1971, which was a little more than a year before all U.S. troops were withdrawn from Vietnam in January 1973 with the signing of the Paris Peace Accords. So Arendt finished these essays during her career in the United States from the 1950s, when she became a citizen, to 1975, when she died in New York City, having taught classes in political theory and philosophy at the New School. So if these essays do not provide answers, as it were, and that's kind of like the old school answers, right? Where the answers are in the back of the algebra book. If they don't provide answers of that sort, they give us a kind of context for looking at the social and political crises that I have attempted to identify and where we currently find ourselves situated now. Brumwich points out that the first of the essays, Truth and Politics, had been occasioned by the need for Arendt to clarify a couple of issues that had emerged pursuant to Arendt's 1963 Eichmann in Jerusalem and the controversy that particular text had engendered. So the first question was whether or not it is always legitimate to tell the truth, which could not be clearer in stating the sort of urgencies that generate our feelings, in short, the ethical crisis that we now confront. Is it always legitimate to tell the truth? And how Arendt would respond to that in our time. And what I'm struck by is that Arendt takes the amazing amount of lies associated with our era as par for the course. And so what she's doing in Eichmann is trying to account for the amazing number of lies that sprung up around that work and about the facts that she had reported in the book. So that first essay, Truth and Politics, marks Arendt's attempt to come to grips with her questions, and it may also serve, Brumwich tells us, as an example of what happens to a highly topical subject when it is drawn into the gap between past and future, which is perhaps the proper habitat of all reflections. So I want to examine in short order my own reflections on Arendt's text and where I believe it leaves me in connection with questions from the audience. As an American, I have been observant, like thousands of my fellow citizens of egregious missteps in U.S. governance over many years, but utterly alarmed and often astonished at both the velocity and depth of misrule since approximately 2003, when a Republican administration invaded Iraq for the second time, and this time predicated on what was not only an unmitigated falsehood that Saddam Hussein's regime had accumulated an enormous quantum of weapons of mass destruction, but an unmitigated lie that was transparently the case, so much so that General Colin Powell's reputation, at least to my mind, never quite recovered from his fervent advocacy of the Bush administration's line, replete with an embarrassing appearance on the floor of the United Nations, as you might remember, armed with props, the supposed vials of the dangerous stuff that Saddam's evil scientists were reportedly concocting. For many Americans, this episode left a high watermark of unseen, unprecedented, unpalatable mark or unpalatable signature of the years of Bush the Younger. Now, that administration, of course, was rife with what I would call error and misrule, but that particular one stands out. But as provocative as these events were, they were nevertheless inadequate preparation for what has befallen the United States between 2015 and the current day in terms of truth and politics. Even though life in the United States between 2003 and 2023 strikes me as simply incredible, Arendt argues that lies, quote, have always been regarded as necessary and justifiable tools, not only of the politicians or of the demagogues, but also of the statesman's trade. Arendt asks why that is the case and what the implications are in this why for both the political realm on the one hand and for the nature and dignity of truth and truthfulness on the other hand. What we are early called upon to bear in mind in Arendt's work is that as she proceeds, she's doing so by way of a duality that she posits on the stage of human endeavor. There is the realm of power or the space of the political, and what seems to me less spatial in Arendt, but nonetheless there, and that is to say truth and truthfulness. So the realm of power and the space of the political, she's placing on one side, and then the realm of truth and truthfulness, she's placing on the other side. This distinction that she's making is central to the text and raises questions like, is it of the very essence of truth to be impotent, and of the very essence of power to be deceitful? And what kind of reality does truth possess if it is powerless in the public realm, which more than any other sphere of human life guarantees reality of existence to natal and mortal men, that is, to beings who know they have appeared out of non-being and after a short while again disappear into it, and is not impotent truth just as despicable as power that gives no heed to truth? Now, these are the questions that Arendt is asking, and that Bromwich is foreground in his introduction to the work. So this persistent abrasion of truth and reality, Arendt says, is predicated on a traditional or classical difference that is inscribed at the heart of philosophical reflection. And that is to say, truth and the world, that is captured in Arendt's rendering of the Latin adage, "Let justice be done, though the world may perish." And the way Bromwich changes that around is, "Let truth be done, though the world may perish." So Arendt is tracking this problematic and its inflections and its nuances through the canonical portals and transitions that encompass Kant, Hobbes, Spinoza, as these thinkers fall in perspective with Socratic wisdom and Plato's philosopher, that is supposed to bring back from his journey into the sky of ideas the true standard for human conduct. So at the same time that Arendt is talking about truths and lies in our time, she's taking us back through certain philosophical ground, a certain philosophical terrain, and putting this question of truth and lies in that context. If truth is bifurcated, as she tells us, between philosophical truth versus factual truth, then what does that mean? And so she's claiming that that is the case in the modern age, as she contends and believes that truth is neither given to nor disclosed to, but produced by the human mind, and that it has been assigned since Leibniz mathematical, scientific, and philosophical truths to the common species of rational truth as distinguished from factual truth. Interestingly enough, Arendt argues that factual truth is quite a lot more fragile and helpless before the onslaught of power than we think, and generally more vulnerable than axioms, discoveries, and theories. The most politically relevant truths are factual, she tells us, even though the conflict between truth and politics was first discovered and articulated with respect to rational truth. Perhaps it is small comfort to learn, Arendt claims, that no one in the long debate about this antagonism of truth and politics from Plato to Hobbes ever believed that organized lying as we know it today could be an adequate weapon against truth. But the nasty surprise for the 21st century is that organized lying, as Arendt puts it, is indeed an adequate weapon against truth. In the traditional philosophical schemata, Plato is more concerned about the sophist and the ignoramus rather than the liar. While none of the major religions, Arendt argues, included lying as such, which she distinguishes from bearing false witness in their assessment of grave sins. Intriguingly, lies were taken to be serious offenses, she claims, only with the rise of Puritan morality coinciding with the rise of organized science and the rise of organized science whose progress had to be assured on the firm ground of the absolute veracity and reliability of every scientist. Historically, the conflict between truth and politics mapped onto two diametrically opposed ways of life. The way of life of the philosopher and the way of life of the citizen. The introduction of transience by way of the citizens' ever-changing opinions about human affairs induced the opposition between truth and mere opinion. This opposition, in turn, throws into antagonism dialogue, which is the adequate speech for philosophical truth, and rhetoric, by which the demagogue persuades the multitude. Where these passages lead us is to Arendt's moment, the world in the aftermath of World War II and the opening salvos of the Cold War, which overlaps our own. And that is the moment where factual truth and politics in their hostility to one another show similar traits. So this complicated dance of concepts and ideas in their historicity and comparative configurations ensues over several pages of her essay, but time will not allow me to do more than gesture toward a few more highlights of the points that she's making. And I want to just address a few salient points in drawing this talk to a close. The result of a consistent and total substitution of lies for factual truth, Arendt argues, is not that the lies will now be accepted as truth and the truth be defamed as lies, but that the sense by which we take our bearings in the real world and the category of truth versus falsehood is among the mental means to this end is being destroyed. Arendt offers no comforts in this text as she concludes on this particular point, that there is no remedy for this trouble because it is the other side of the disturbing contingency of all factual reality, that lying is the other side of this disturbing contingency of the facts. In other words, everything that has happened and everything that happens in the realm of human affairs could just as well have been otherwise, so that the boundless possibilities for lying may well be the liar's undoing. And if there is a silver lining anywhere in this argument, I think that may be it. In other words, those who adjust images and stories to ever-changing circumstances will find themselves floating on the wide open horizon of potentiality, drifting from one possibility to the next, unable to hold on to any one of their fabrications. These myriad shapes that shift and morph into a boundless field of potentiality is the trembling, wobbling motion of everything that lends a sense of orientation and is among the most common and most vivid experiences of men under totalitarian rule. Is what she argues there. But in their stubbornness, facts are superior to power. They are less transitory than power formations. All right, so this particular writing, this particular essay ends where I don't necessarily expect it to end or even need it to end. And that is to say that Arendt has what she calls equal eyes for what she's describing here as, how is she putting it? An equal eyes between one's interest in the political and between the disinterested. And the point that she's making there is that as long as we are interested in an outcome, that we are actually forfeiting the validity of truth, that we have to be uninterested, that we have to stand aside like the truth teller and adopt the truth teller's standpoint. And the truth teller's standpoint is forfeited, as is the validity of what he or she has to say if he tries to interfere directly in human affairs and to speak the language of persuasion or violence. The truth teller, whose standpoint, she argues, is located outside the political realm, apparently must accept one of the modes of being alone: the philosopher's solitude, the isolation of the scientist and the artist, the impartiality of the historian and the judge, and the independence of the fact finder, the witness, and the reporter. What all these modes of being alone have in common is that as long as any one of them lasts, no political commitment, no adherence to a cause is possible. Only when one of them is adopted as a way of life is it likely to conflict with the demands of the political. And that's the end of a long quotation from Arendt. So these politically relevant functions are ironically, quote, performed from outside the political realm. They require non-commitment and impartiality, freedom from self-interest in thought and judgment. In other words, this is a looking with equal eyes upon friend and foe, upon success and defeat. And you can see why that ending would kind of leave one in abeyance or in suspense. In any case, it's now clear to me that what I'm missing and have had such difficulty trying to formulate as an articulate problematic or an articulate problem or an ethics for the everyday is precisely interstitial to the Arendtian being alone and an embodied subject of Black studies and women's studies, both historically and epistemologically. In other words, an ethical understanding would arise in the interstices or in the in-betweens when Arendt suggests, for example, that being alone is not absolute, that life is never lived in complete solitude or isolation or independence. It is the shadowy place of neither that renders the dance of interrogation or questions from the audience. I think I'll stop there. Thank you. Right.
Thank you, Hortense. And I'll remind audience members here with us or online to, if you do have a question or comment, you're more than welcome to walk up to that microphone that's there. If you're online, you're more than welcome to join us in the space and speak to Hortense directly. I leave it to you. Yeah, I see a hand up. Go ahead, Mary.
Hello.
Hi.
Thank you for that profound and really deep talk. And as a fellow American, I feel many of the same anxieties and worries and questions about separateness and solidarity. I think my question that I want to ask you to expand upon has to do with the issue of boundlessness. I kind of like the idea that liars will be defeated by their own boundlessness because of the free-floating qualities that attach to that orientation.
Yeah.
I guess the question I have, though, is that it seems to me that the world of empirical science and the technological expansion from gains in empirical knowledge also seem to engender certain kinds of boundlessness, which is, I guess, to say or to ask, if that's an acceptable proposition, where would the kind of the stubborn facts of empirical science, how would that get aligned with the kind of truth that Arendt is invested in? The scientist was one of those figures who counts as being alone, but science as it gets applied also upturns a lot of, back in high school, I think it is, we learned how Copernicus, upturns the God-based orientation, and Darwin upturns the God-based orientation, and so forth. So I guess I would like to hear more about how you think about science in relation to boundlessness and in relation to these tensions or these oppositions between the liars and the kind of those committed to truth.
Yeah. Thank you very much for your question. And as you were talking, I was thinking about those unidentified flying objects over North America the last several days. And I was thinking that the boundlessness of Arendt, the Arendtian boundlessness, is really being proposed from the 30,000 feet perspective, right? She's well above well above the ground, so that I like the idea, but the application seems to me heavenly, and the distance removed that the taxpaying citizen with their feet on the ground every day cannot acquire, right? I mean, it's the position from which the United States Supreme Court, or the conservatives of the United States Supreme Court, it's from that place that they issue their verdicts. And those of us down here on the ground have to live with it. That's the way I feel about the boundlessness. I'm not sure it's applicable. It's wonderful to think that the universe that we seem to be almost overwhelmed by, that is woven of a tissue of lies, that is predicated on a scaffold of lies. It's good to imagine that their boundlessness will be their undoing, but how you live with that, I think, is the question that you're asking, right? Which I think is the question that I'm asking. And so I would also, in relationship to the question that you're asking, say that science would also have a way of exalting itself above where we are, right? I mean, the disciplinary responses to, I think, what we are feeling on the ground makes us feel a lot better than we actually do feel, because what they propose is the theoretical possibility that elsewhere in those two essays by Arendt, she talks about how lying and making stuff up is really the work of imagination, that there's a degree of creativity in it. I mean, that's a kind of theoretical response, or theoretical contextualizing, or theoretical work that makes it possible to think about Fox News without hyperventilating, so that there are really two of us responding. There's the theorist in us that's trying to get that elevated look down on the scene that we're living in, or living on, and then there's the person who lives the everyday. And it's the trick is negotiating between those two spaces, and people on the ground, those of us on the ground looking for answers, have no answer except to keep doing what we do. I mean, in other words, to keep witnessing for what we regard as the truth, to keep responding to it in our way. You can try to vote for the people that you think are truth tellers and against the election deniers, right? I mean, we are quite limited in that sense. But I do get what you're saying about the boundlessness. I just think that it's it's far away from where we live. What do you think?
I think it's a really good point, because what you're getting at is that kind of both sides would envision a boundlessness in a way that kind of defers the present. And
Yeah.
and I guess the question or the thought, and I really appreciate your answer, the thought is the exilic consciousness itself has to kind of imagine a duality of long-term future and absolute present,
Mhm.
and has to also be divided in a way that still enables action, and not just separation. So thank you.
Yeah.
That's a very nice answer. Thanks.
Okay. Wonderful. Thank you for that exchange.
Likewise.
I see that Carlos has popped a question into the chat. Carlos, would you like to read it out, or I could read it out on your behalf if you prefer? Please read it for me. No worries. All right. So, Carlos, thanks you, Horton, so much for this fabulous lecture. The question is, as a student of English, I wonder about the role of literature in our context of compounding crisis. Literature being a realm that bends the concepts of truth and lies. In times of unavoidable ethical considerations, should our literary priorities shift? Perhaps we need a new idea of literary beauty, one that is inseparable from ethics, ? An ethics of implication and a duty to reimagine everything.
It's a wonderful question. And it's not unlike I think a question that I carry around in my head all the time, a question that is with me all the time. And I think two things, and I think two things at once, or a few things at once. And one of the things I think is that literature, that we, how to put this, that we live in the atmosphere of literature. Those of us who are students of literature and history and culture, that we are always in literature because we're always in the discursive, so that we might put aside for a moment literature proper, but it's not really the literary that we're ever rid of once we're in it. I mean, once we are committed to reading and writing, we are children of the discursive, witnesses to the discursive, subjects of the discursive order. We are always there. But what we do with literature proper tends, okay, how many novels have you read this week? How many poems have you read this week? Maybe you haven't read any this week, but whatever it is that those particular things teach us, we hang on to, because I think that literature proper might be the one place that even when it is lying, respects the truth or knows that it's lying. In other words, I think of literature, and please correct me if I'm wrong. I'm sure there may be something that I am forgetting, but I think of writing, I think of literature as the ultimate ethical position or the ultimate taking of an ethical position. And I say that because I believe that writers have to be conscious and aware in ways that perhaps other people are not or don't have to be, so that I believe writers, I trust writers even when they are lying. I would trust them to know or to have some insight into the truth, so that I think it is out of literariness and literature proper, that our own passion for the ethical, if it does not arise from that place, it draws alimentation, it draws nourishment, it draws breath and oxygen from that place. So that to my mind, we drive literature or literariness to the next place or the next point, but I don't think we get rid of it, nor do I think we need to. I don't think it has a replacement, because when you think of all the questions that we raise, the little ones, the big ones, the ongoing ones, the transitory ones, all come out of literariness. And by that, I mean the discursive, the thoughtful, on paper or on the human tongue. I mean, it's all coming out of the literary, is the way I would answer that question.
Oh, the camera's on me. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi. Thank you for your talk
Hi.
today, Dr. Spillers. You began with talking about, citizenship and what it feels like to be a citizen. I want to start my question with something just incidental that happened today. I went to go see the exhibition here in town in Montreal of the works of Jean-Michel Basquiat, and there's a page of his from one of his notebooks that simply reads, "I feel like a citizen. It's time to go and come back a drifter." And I just thought, there were, maybe hundreds of pages of his notebook, taken out and framed, and that one caught my eye. Came to this talk, very interesting. But my question is about what you think the role of institutions in liberal democracies is in defending truth or promoting truth in the face of the contradictions of power and truth that Arendt talked about. I was thinking about, Maximilian Robespierre's formulation that terror without virtue is murderous, and virtue without terror is powerless. And you talked about misrule and the various atrocities that, arise out of our compound kind of 21st century crises. But I'm thinking about, the history of the 20th century, which you also talked about, and, the same government and the same United Nations that created the Universal Declaration of Human Rights also gave its blessing to a genocidal campaign on the Korean Peninsula. The same President Eisenhower, who sent the National Guard in to enforce Brown v. Board of Education.
Mhm.
Also, like, staged a war of colonial plunder and fascist reaction in Guatemala. You know, the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act under Lyndon Johnson. You know, the bombing of Vietnam and its invasion. The history of atrocity and American power and, you know, the liberal democratic framework that it operates under,
Mhm.
you know, what truth is there in that but violence and material, you know, kind of interests in geopolitics? Is there anything truthful about these forms of government, these institutions? Can they do anything? Are they powerless? Are we powerless? Are we truthful? Can we in any way resolve these contradictions with these institutions, or do we need to get rid of them? And how do we work that out is my question.
Wow, that's that's an enormous question. And I suppose the $1 billion Elon Musk question, right? That one. And what to say? Well, there really is no answer to that. There is I can respond to it by way of an attempt to just open the conversation. But as you were talking, I was thinking that, yep, they're the contradictions. What you point out. And it's those contradictions that we live with every day, and those questions that we raise by way of those contradictions every day, all the time. And I think what I would say to you is that the statement that you articulated ended in interrogation or a question mark, and I think that's the question mark, or the mark of interrogation that we live with all the time. And it goes something like this. I was thinking earlier today, all right, how do you begin this talk, or this talk today? Or how do you have a certain feeling about this particular thing? How would you weave that into the talk? And one of the things that I was asking myself in thinking about today's talk is, how would you say to an audience, why does January 6th, 2022 matter to me? Why should I care? What difference does it make? If the police can do thus and so to you and millions of other people because of the color of your skin, and the long train of discontent that drags behind Africanity, if you think about that, and then you think about January 6th, the question, why does that matter, is more than rhetorical. You have to think about why it matters. You have to think about why the life of a democracy that is forever in a state of perfection and never quite there, that is always going toward a goal that is like the horizon. It is forever receding. And as a matter of fact, I am currently living in a state that seems to me making every effort to walk backward into that past that we had supposedly left, as is the case with the so-called red states that I would consider neo-Confederacy. If that's the case, then what do we say about institutions? What are we going to do with institutions and about institutions? And why should we care if they survive or succeed? And I would say that we care because we are daring to ride the contradiction. And that's the answer that I would have. And you would have to think about double consciousness in order to answer the question. So far as I am concerned, there is no reason to resolve double consciousness or to be rid of double consciousness. The problem is to ride it or to mount it. And so what that means, so far as I am concerned, is that we are in effect citizens at the same time that we are drifters and fugitives, that we are riding simultaneously runaway horses that are running in different directions. Now, how do you do that? That's what I think is the case if you are what James Baldwin at the end of The Fire Next Time talked about, that relatively few of us who are conscious, Black and white. That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to mount a contradiction and ride a contradiction at the same time that we are pulling for the idea of the Democratic to win, knowing that institutions are corrupt and betray us all the time, that individuals are corrupt and betray us all the time. And we can think of, well, as a Black woman, I can think of instances where women and Black people to this very day stand for the wrong thing. Does that mean that I have to become anti-Black or anti-feminist in a world where there are Carrie Lakes, or in a world where there are Black Republicans? No, I don't think that's what it means at all. It means that I have to become even more a witness in a world where I am endangered, but I recognize the danger. In a world where I accept the contradictions, but I'm not necessarily trying to resolve them or smooth them out. I'm trying to mount them and live with them. If that might serve as a kind of response to the question that you ask, and the questions that I ask myself, that I have to try to systematically answer why it matters to me that there are people held responsible for January 6th, or that a person who attempted to bring down an imperfect government does not get a chance to do that again. I have a stake in that. I have a stake in that outcome. And I would have to say that very good friends of mine would have a different idea about that. They would look at me and say, well, why vote? I mean, why does anybody vote? I mean, why do you care? what happens to this institution and that institution. I mean, why are you committed to that? It never did anything for you. And that's the interesting part. That's where I am invested in the contradiction, and what I mean when I say mounting the contradiction, because one of those responses is choosing. I would say one of those responses is choosing to memorialize grief, which I regard as a stop sign, which I regard as a politically conservative position. It is a radically conservative posture, it seems to me, that stops time and says we can't go forward because we don't have perfection. But it seems to me radically progressive to keep going, and to keep going with what a very famous romantic poet called negative capability. I don't know how it's going to end. I don't know what's going to happen in the United States. There are times when I look at the United States and Canada and wonder about democracies in North America, period. There are times when I look north, and you all are our North Star there in Canada. You have to realize that, true or false, right or wrong. When we think of, well, where am I going to exile? I'm going to Canada. That's always been the North Star, right? For a couple 100 years, or at least since the late 18th century? Canada and North America has been the place. Now, Canadian history and Canadians themselves will say, oh, yeah, right. But it's true. I mean, mythically, that is the case. But, I wondered when those truckers stopped things in Canada, or when there was that odd mayor back in Toronto some years ago, I really started going, well, I think of Canadians as the sensible people on the continent. What's with this guy? You all know who I'm talking about, right? So there are times when I wonder, how long will the Canadians be able to resist the Trump movement and the lying that attempts to substitute for reality? How long is that going to be the case? Because I look in admiration toward the North and go, well, they've held out so far. How long is that going to be the case? So, okay, as imperfect and despite the contradictions, I think I'm saying that we have to keep voting for what we regard as the truth. And at some point, that might become dangerous to do. To act is to be in danger, Baldwin said. And at some point, that might not be so easy.
Thank you, Hortense. I know we have some minutes left. I wonder if you're able to take a few more questions.
Sure.
Yeah, great. All right, go ahead, please.
Hi, Dr. Spillers.
Yes.
Thank you. My name's Brian, and I wanted to ask a question about Black Studies
Yes.
as a discipline. And just as a background, here in Canada, a number of universities have committed to creating Black Studies programs in the past 2 years, basically in the wake of the George Floyd incident.
Mhm.
And there's a lot of skepticism from some people about the institutionalization of Black Studies in universities and how it could lose its critical edge or its radical edge through the institutionalization.
Mhm.
So a scholar like Sylvia Wynter talks about the coloniality of truth, the Eurocentricity of the kinds of truth that come out of universities or other institutions. And so I'm just wondering what you think the role of Black studies, either in universities or fugitively outside of university spaces or in them but not of them, what that might contribute to this debate about more ethical forms of truth.
Thank you very much for that question. Yeah, that's a big one too. I'm happy to know that Canadian institutions are making a move in that direction. I think that's a good thing. But like all questions in reference to Africanity, a question is never just a question, right? It's always a question plus something else. And the question is what happens to truth when an institution touches it or when it becomes something else. And I would want to say in connection with that a couple of things, and one of them is this. I think those persons who institute Black studies need to bear in mind whenever they were born, they need to bear in mind the origin story of Black studies. And if you bear in mind the origin story of Black studies, I think that will help out the attitude I heard in Brian's question, in but not of. And this is what I mean by that. You're in the institution. There is no reason why you should not be in the institution. But then you are also in a moment. And the moment that you are in has nuance. You are in the moment where movement this morning becomes study or a curricular object in the afternoon, so that you are living your history. I mean, the historical moment out of which you were created is something that you can touch with your bare hands. That's not true for many other disciplines, but it is true for women's studies, gender studies, all the studies that come in the 1960s. You grow out of the streets, off the streets, movement that is alive and bristling with certain kinds of questions. And you are now taking those questions and you're transforming them into the curriculum, what I call curricular objects or subjects of the curriculum. And I think that means always having an eye for where you're coming from or for origins. And if that's the case, then I think what you don't lose is a kind of insight. In other words, you don't lose your peripheral vision. You don't lose an eye for nuance and for the interstitial or the shadowy. You don't lose touch with that. I mean, you don't become, how to put this, you don't become a Manichaean in your thinking. I mean, in other words, you can never say definitively, I am a capitalist, or I am a this, or I am a that. I mean, you're always sort of like, well, you're in that space where nothing, where you are accepting the uncertainty and the contradiction of your position. That's what I mean by insightfulness. I think what happens with a lot of disciplines is that they lose whatever that human and historical element is in their founding and in their creating. Disciplines are not sent to us from God. They are not created by a divine spark. I mean, they come out of human activity. Very often they come out of human stress. They come out of danger. I mean, for instance, there are Black Studies programs in the United States that were created in the threat of violence. The Black Studies program at Brandeis University that celebrated its 50th anniversary 4 or 5 years ago was created from a student sit-in. With the threat of police power hanging over us, those of us who were in that building for 11 days, the threat of police power hanging over us for 11 days. And all the Brandeis faculty had to do was call up the Massachusetts National Guard and say, come on over here. And they would have been in there in a minute. And we know exactly what would have happened when they got there, because they were raring to go. That was the word on the street, that they cannot wait to get their hands on you little monkeys in their building. But that didn't happen. Something else happened instead. So for those people who created Black Studies at Brandeis University, that particular moment was always there in their activity as pedagogues, their activity as scholars. That memory that could have been a whole different kind of memory. I could not be sitting here today. I mean, I could have gotten beat up by the police or something, maimed or maybe killed even. That's the kind of danger that I'm talking about, that one has to be aware of, if not actually, then historically. That's where these programs start. So that the episteme, or epistemologically, these programs come out of histories that hurt. To go back to a point Fred Jameson makes some years ago. I mean, they go back to human activity, and that has to be borne in mind. So with that in mind, the insightfulness of the historical, a respect for the humility of the moment out of which this particular circumstance was born, was not created by royalty or by the office of His Majesty, was created elsewhere. Kind of blood, sweat, and tears, right? That moment should be respected. I think if that's the case, You can have Black studies in Canada and it's okay. It will be all right. At least that's the way I would read it.
Thank you. Thank you, Hortense. Nikita, would you like to go ahead?
Thank you so much for a great talk, Dr. Spillers. Okay, you talk about lies and truth as if they were kind of I think my hang on. Let me just stop that for a second. As if they were kind of absolutes. And of course, when you're invoking Arendt, her ideas of lies are very much tied to the idea of propaganda. And I think about communicating truth and how, and even ideas of truth, when statistically now, 34% of people believe newspapers, thinking back to Richard Wright's Native Son, where he is reading about himself in, all the propaganda that is actually representing him wrongly, well, and rightly, like both. And he reads about himself and thinks that, oh, that's me. But it isn't me. And I guess really, I don't think we can talk in any kind of purity about truth and lies in terms of what constitutes truth, what constitutes lies, like fake news, other news, whatever. So I love the idea of there being some kind of there being a kind of absolute thing, but how it's communicated, I don't know. Like whether it's through literature, whatever. And I find it very hard to have that kind of purity of Arendt, which is very much tied to, nobody uses the terms propaganda around fake news. Like nobody uses the term propaganda around what Trump spewed out. Like it isn't even a term that's used, presumably because it came from, a bad place or a bad experience, but that is effectively what it is. And just, I guess my question, when you're calling for the idea that we need to get beyond lies, is like how that could even take place right now.
Yeah, it's a wonderful question. And there are times when I think about, what you just said about propaganda there. That's one of the things I was thinking about as you were asking your question. And there are times when I ask myself, well, is what I believe propaganda? There's Fox News and the Trumpists, and we all recognize that as propaganda. But then is MSNBC, which is my news source of choice for television news, is that propaganda? And I ask myself that question. So I think you're very right that lies and truth are terms that don't say exactly what it is, or they speak as though there is a purity that we can claim about either, that there is a distinction that we can determine between the two. And I think you're more right than it makes me comfortable believing that what we're really talking about in terms of where and how we live is a spectrum, right? That that we're really talking about performance and belief, of praxis and belief along a spectrum, and that is more or less the case. And then I think about okay, but truth, in what ways do we mean it? I'm a rheumatoid arthritis patient. There's no cure for rheumatoid arthritis. You can treat it. I take a weekly injection for it. If the stiffness gets bad enough, I can take a Tylenol. Okay, that's one kind of truth. I have that, and that's the truth of it. So there's truth like that. And then there are kinds of truth, right? Or even kinds of lies. Is Santa Claus a lie? I mean, we wouldn't want to say that that's, you know, a lie like some other kinds of lies. All of that has to be taken into account if you're gonna do the thing definitively, which we are never doing. I mean, we're always talking about some corner of truth or some corner of lying or some kind of truth or some kind of lying, right? That we can all more or less agree upon. I think we can all more or less agree upon that well, as I put it to myself, one of the reasons why I am against the January 6th insurrection, even though there may be moments when I could see insurrectionary activity, the reason why I am against this particular insurrection is that the people who are for it are not friends of mine. The Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys are not friends of mine, and they never would be. And they never could be. And they envision a world where people like myself don't exist, even if you have to kill them. So that's why I have to be against that particular lie. So we're confronted with things like that all the time that are pretty cut and dry. But what do you do when there are times when things are not so cut and dry, right? I mean, when the lying and the truth telling kind of shaded or don't quite hit that mark of this and that, or either or. So yeah, I get your question, and I would agree with that. And would say that there are times though when what one must choose is actually rather clear, right? Clearer than it would be at other times. But yes, I acknowledge that certainly it's harder and harder to know given the greater and greater sophistication of technology. Professor Powell introduced me as emerita at the beginning, and there are times when I'm actually grateful that I am emerita, because I wonder now, well, what do you do with Chat GPT? What's that thing called that can now write a great essay? An essay that even I might give a B plus or an A minus, and I pride myself on always knowing, even if I don't have to look it up, when you plagiarized. I pride myself on that. And I pride myself on it because I had some tough grammarians as teachers. So that one thing that I learned when I was not getting algebra well, I was learning, picking up from my elder siblings, my sister and my brothers, what a direct object of the verb was and what an indirect object. I learned all that stuff. So that by the time I got to the 7th grade, I was really pretty good with grammar. That's trailed me all my life. So that I can tell if you're treating the English language like it is a second language, which a lot of English speakers do. And that turns up in the writing. So or if somebody who doesn't necessarily make the most grammatical sentences out loud is suddenly on paper an eloquent speaker and an exquisite writer. Well, now you didn't what? What are you talking about? Of course you didn't write this. But I don't know what I would do today with technology that's figuring all that out. So I'm glad I'm retired. So yeah, you're right about truth and lies. I mean, it's getting harder and harder, right? So I see your point.
Well, thank you, Hortense. We have reached the end of our time. I wonder if Stephen wanted to come up and say a word of thanks, or not to put you on the spot, Stephen. But...
Well, I can't imagine not wanting to thank Hortense Spillers for that amazing address, and for the thoughtful and provocative questions from the audience. To thank those people who put those forward, and to thank Professor Spillers again for amazing answers to those questions, which are, confront us as members of the audience, however we conceive that. So thank you all for coming, and for those in cyberspace, thank you for being there, and thank you
so much.
Spillers.
Thank you. This was a wonderful event. Great audience. Thank you. Thank you very much.
All right, folks. Well, in that case, first of all, Hortense, I will personally extend a welcome back to Montreal, this time in sunny weather.
Thank you.
This time around. Thank you so much for your time and your energy and your insight and thoughtful answers. I echo what Stephen just shared. And thanks for all of you also who came in person, and those of you on Zoom. We see your comments, we see your love, your attention, and your thanks there as well. And we'll be sure to share that transcript with Hortense, as I know we didn't get to some comments in there. Okay, folks, we're going to close up this online space now. Wish you a great weekend, and thanks again. Until next time. Bye.
Thank you so very much. Thank you. Bye-bye.